We're going to resume here, not only just with the effects of the famine and the effects of the Great Bovine Pestilence, but also the effects of the Black Death, which we looked at in more detail last week. An impact of all of these things coming together is by the middle of the 14th century, the population of the clergy was really, really badly hit. As we talked about last week, they were the ones administering the last rites. Yeah, they picked up the bacteria pretty quickly. So a lot of people who worked for the church died. But at the same time, it's the main place that people were turning to for an explanation. As we saw last week, most people thought that the Black Death was caused by God, that God was displeased with them and had brought it upon them. So at the same time as they're turning to the church for answers, the church is not able to provide answers because they're dying. This means they had to push through new priests because the communities needed priests. And when they pushed these new priests through, they weren't as good as the old ones. They weren't very well trained. There was all sorts of reports about how they could barely read or speak Latin even. Actually, during the Black Death, a papal indulgence, that is a papal allowance, was granted whereby people could choose their own confessor at the end. They didn't need to have a priest there. And that was because there were so few priests to hear everybody's confession when they were dying from the Black Death. Upshot of all of this is people kind of turned to themselves and for a personal relationship with God, which is going to be a big factor in the Reformation when we get to that the week after next. Now, most people do seem to have realised that ordinary priests were doing their best. But at the same time, there were still violent attacks on churchmen because people felt really let down by their behaviour. Some historians have said, oh, that's just because people were generally mad, they had a lot on their plates, as we'll see in the peasant uprisings later in this Nearpod. But certainly popular religion became more personal. Cat, get off the keyboard. Oh my God, that cat is so fat and heavy. Oh, got to work out there. Popular religion went on an upsurge. People wanted a personal relationship. They couldn't turn to somebody to mediate for them. The increased personal, individual nature of worship, combined with the fact that they believed that these things were caused by God, probably led to an uptick in religious activities and an uptick in individualism. Ways that people manage to sustain this include going on pilgrimage, charity, mysticism, just ways to maintain a personal religious connection. So another way we see that is in saintly cults, particularly if they had imagery associated with plague, like this guy on the slide here, Saint Sebastian. And Saint Sebastian was a popular plague saint. As you can see here, he's being depicted with arrows, and this was taken as being a symbol for the plague raining down on people. So cults like for Saint Sebastian, but also local saint cults were on the rise. There was a huge fear of death and sudden death when people knew they couldn't have the last rites. And so they thought that if they had local saintly cults, it might appease God, make him happy, and hopefully it wouldn't happen to them. There's also huge guilt that some historians have described as being like a mass form of PTSD after the Black Death, in that the way the dead were treated. This led to, increased interest in what happens after death, anniversary masses being said, interest in these stories about purgatory that we looked at earlier in the semester. Lots more artistic representations too, to encourage people to atone for their sins, turn to good deeds. Now this was of course around before, as we know, but it really did increase after the plague. So people were turning to religion for answers, but as we saw with the famine, people were not able to pay their tithes, pay their dues to the church. Was one of the first things that went. At the same time, they're turning to the church to provide charity, to provide food. They weren't able to do that. And then with the Black Death, they were turning to them for an answer, to provide hospital care. they weren't able to do that because obviously famine was a short-term effect of the plague as well. So people are turning to the church as their welfare, as their safety net, and the church won't help them, can't help them. And this makes people very angry on top of all these other things. And then it gets even worse because there are problems within the formal ordering of the church as well. First of these is what we call the Avignon papacy. By the 13th century, the Pope has the most power that he's ever had. He claims authority over both church and state, and this was going to set him up for problems against different monarchs, especially monarchs like the French king, who believed that he should have ultimate power over his area rather than the Pope. So tensions really exploded when Pope Boniface asserted that he was number one over King Philip IV of France. This Philip was also known as Philip the Fair. As we're going to see, Philip's a really popular name for kings of France. It's super confusing. Really, the big issue was taxation. As we're going to see in a minute, Philip is at war with the English over the English lands in France. This is the 100 Years' War. And he wanted to tax the French clergy like they were going on crusade to pay for the 100 Years' War. And the Pope was like, you are not taxing the clergy to pay for your own little private war. It's not happening. So Philip was mad. And in 1301, Philip tests his power by arresting Bernard Sassay, who was the Bishop of Pamiers, on a trumped-up treason charge. Boniface was so mad, but Philip had the public backing of the French people. So in 1302, Philip summoned the representatives from feudal France, the clergy, the nobles, the townspeople, to state his case. He got their support for accusing Bernard Sassay of treason. In response, Pope Boniface issued the papal bull. Remember, the papal bull is a papal law. This one is called Unam Sanctam in 1302, and it declared, I'm just going to quote from it, "It is altogether necessary to salvation for every human being to be subject to the Roman pontiff." Now, the Roman pontiff is another term for the Pope. Necessary to salvation. That means necessary to the future of your immortal soul, that you are subject to the Pope. So this is a direct response to what Philip was doing. Philip, in turn, reacted. He didn't go away, of course, of this. No, in crazy, crazy style, he tried to kidnap the Pope, to bring him to Paris, to put him on trial for heresy. Yeah, just let that sink in. The King of France tries to kidnap the Pope to accuse him on trial of heresy. Yeah, the world has gone crazy, and this is still the beginning of the 14th century. They haven't even had the Black Death yet. The Pope is rescued, but then he dies a month later. So Philip is like, oh, good, that worked out for the best. So Philip uses his influence to ensure that a buddy of his, a Frenchman, was made Pope. This Pope was Clement V. Clement V used civil unrest in Rome as an excuse to be like, oh, I'm a Frenchman, I'm not welcome in Rome, and Rome's really dangerous. It's very dangerous to be Pope in Rome. I'm going to go and, for my own safety and for the safety of the church, go and live somewhere else. And this somewhere else he picked was Avignon. Avignon technically was not in France. Technically, it was in the Holy Roman Empire, but it was directly across the river from France. So it's a bit like East Cape Girardeau is technically in Illinois because it's across the river from us. But, you know, if SEMO had a rival school that went over to East Cape Girardeau, we would see it as being an affront to us. It's kind of like that. Clement pitched up there in Avignon, in the south of France, 1309. He stayed there, but so did many of his subsequent popes. The Pope stayed in Avignon from 1309 to 1377. This became nicknamed the Avignon papacy, and even within that, the nickname was the Babylonian captivity. They were all going to point at biblical stories for how the position of the Pope was being held captive to the whims of a political leader. So this is bad, but it's going to get even more complicated. Oh, why are we looking at St. Catherine of Siena? Oh, there's St. Catherine. You're awake now. You've seen St. Catherine of Siena's head. I don't know why St. Catherine of Siena's head's here, but now you've seen it and you're all traumatized. Back to the papal schism. Ninja paper, ninja saintly head, ninja relics. Didn't mean to do that. I hope nobody's been sick. Okay, hope nobody was eating their dinner when watching this video. Okay, back to the papal schism. So we've got the Pope in Avignon. And by the time we hit 1378, there's been popes in Avignon for a long time. And the people are like, seriously, go back to Rome. You're the Pope. You're by definition supposed to be in bloody Rome. So the Pope in Avignon's like, I'm not going back to Rome. So the people in the Rome, the cardinals are like, fine then. We're just going to make a Pope in Rome. So between 1378 and 1409, there are not one, but two popes. There's the Pope in Avignon and there's the Pope in Rome. And they both claim to be Pope. And then to confuse you even further, from 1409 to 1417, a third Pope based in Bologna in Italy joined them. 3 popes. Each Pope excommunicated the other. Each Pope had their own college of cardinals. And each Pope had their own followers. This means that they are really, really, really hard to tell apart. Technically, 1 or 2, depending on what time it was, of these popes, technically an anti-pope. And I put a definition here on the slide for you. A person who claims or exercises the office of pope in opposition to the true pope of the time. So that is as clear as mud. And this means we're confused. Who's the pope? How confused would you be if you were an actual medieval person? Super, super confused. It actually even feeds warfare because France supports its pope, Avignon. England is at war with France. Hey, England's like, I'm going to support Rome. It's a way to get back at France. Portugal changes its mind 4 times as to who it thinks the real pope is. It's a mess, absolute mess. The upshot of it is there is a hugely weakened image amongst the people of the church and increased criticism because they're criticizing them at the grassroots level and they turn to the Pope. They don't know who the Pope is. It's a complete mess. They don't know who the Pope is until the Council of Constance, which takes 4 years to decide that what it needs to do is depose 3 popes and then elect an entirely new Pope, who is going to be Martin V. And that solves the whole thing. 1418, that's when it takes it to get sorted out. So if we're confused, people were really confused. The Reformation is coming in 2 weeks' time. Doubtless, this all factored into people's call for reform and a new form of religion. Because it allowed a lot of corruption. I seen this myself when I was doing my PhD. I studied the castle of one of the bishops, the Bishop of Down. His name was John Seeley. And John Seeley was done by one of the popes for living in his castle in Seine with a woman called Letitia. Her name's actually spelled Lettuce, which confused me greatly, but it's pronounced Letitia. And he was, you're not supposed to have, a concubine. You're supposed to not live in a castle with her. So he got taken to the papal court. When he didn't get the decision that he wanted, he took it to one of the other popes to see if he could get a better decision to be made. And this was not uncommon. And if you're an ordinary person and this is going on, you're going to be pretty mad. Okay, I'm going to stop here because that is the end of the religious segment. The next thing that you've got to do is watch a YouTube clip, a comedy clip, and I will explain how I can use that comedy clip to teach the 100 Years' War in, give or take 15 minutes.